The Blood Moon's Curse, a town's dark secret revealed. Chapter 1. A town lost in shadows. The town hadn't changed much in all the years Eva had been away. Yet, as the bus rattled along the narrow, winding road that led into the heart of this forgotten place, something heavy settled in her chest. The air felt thicker, like it was clinging to her skin, weighing her down as if the town itself was reluctant to let her go. She leaned against the window, staring at the rolling fields and distant, crumbling houses that dotted the landscape. It all felt familiar and alien at once. As the bus creaked to a halt, the old wooden sign that marked the town's entrance came into view. Welcome to Thornbrook, population 572. The letters were faded and chipped, barely legible under the layers of grime. The driver gave her a quick glance, his weathered face betraying no emotion, but his eyes lingered a second longer than necessary. Eva offered a polite nod and stepped down from the bus, her shoes crunching on the gravel road. The bus hissed and groaned, as if glad to be rid of her, and pulled away without ceremony, leaving her standing alone in the strange silence. The stillness felt unnatural. Thornbrook had never been lively, even in her childhood, but now the quiet felt suffocating. It was the kind of silence that wasn't just an absence of sound, but the presence of something waiting just beyond the senses, hidden in the shadows. Eva hefted her small suitcase and began the short walk toward her mother's house. The streets were deserted, though she could see movement behind drawn curtains and shadowed windows. The houses, once quaint and modest, now stood dilapidated and weathered. Paint peeled from the siding and shutters hung crookedly, as if the town itself had long given up on keeping appearances. She passed a man sitting on a porch, his head tilted down as if engrossed in some invisible task. He didn't look up when she walked by. Neither did the woman pulling weeds from her flower bed, her hands moving in slow, methodical motions. No one greeted her. No one acknowledged her presence. It was as if she were a ghost, slipping through the town unnoticed. The only sound was her own footsteps, echoing against the cracked pavement. Eva's mind drifted to her mother, Agnes. The phone call had been brief, delivered in the cold, clinical tones of a nurse from the local clinic. "Your mother isn't doing well. You should come as soon as you can." That was all they'd said before hanging up. She hadn't spoken to her mother in years. Distance had crept in between them, slowly at first and then all at once, widening with each passing year. Thornbrook was a place Eva had worked hard to forget, but the call had brought it all rushing back. As the familiar outline of her childhood home came into view, a feeling of dread swept over her. The house was as she remembered, modest, two-storied, with a sloping roof that seemed to sag under the weight of neglect. Weeds had overtaken the garden, and the paint was faded, flaking off like dead skin. The windows, once filled with warm light in the evenings, now stared back at her, dark and lifeless. Eva stood at the gate for a moment, gripping the rusted latch. She hadn't expected to feel this. Uneasy. Nostalgia, perhaps. Or maybe guilt for staying away so long. But there was something else, something more, lurking at the edges of her thoughts. The air felt wrong here, charged with something she couldn't name. She pushed the gate open and walked up the path. The front door groaned in protest as she opened it, the hinges squealing like an old wound reopened. Inside, the house smelled of dust and stale air, as if it had been sealed off from the world for far too long. "Mom?" Eva called, her voice sounding too loud in the oppressive silence. No answer. Her footsteps echoed through the hallway as she made her way to the living room, her eyes scanning the familiar yet unfamiliar surroundings. The furniture was all still there, arranged exactly as it had been when she was a child. But everything seemed muted, washed out, faded by time, and something else she couldn't quite put her finger on. She found her mother upstairs, lying in bed, eyes closed. Agnes looked small, fragile, as if the years had hollowed her out, leaving only a frail shell behind. Her breathing was shallow, but steady, and for a moment Eva wasn't sure if she should wake her. There was something about the peacefulness of the room, the way the light filtered through the curtains, that made her pause. But as Eva stood there, taking in the sight of her ailing mother, a faint whisper tickled the back of her mind. It wasn't a voice, exactly, more like the echo of a thought, a feeling of being watched. She turned quickly, but there was no one. Just the empty hallway, stretching out behind her like a dark tunnel. Later that evening, after settling into her old room, Eva ventured into town to grab a few supplies. The market was almost as deserted as the streets, with only a few old women huddled in the corners, whispering in low voices. The clerk at the counter barely glanced at her as she paid, muttering something under his breath that sounded like a prayer or a curse. As she left the market, Eva spotted a familiar figure standing near the old sheriff's office, Jonah. He hadn't changed much, still broad-shouldered and stoic, with that same steady look in his eyes. They'd been close once, back when the world was smaller and simpler, but time had eroded their connection, just like it had with everything else in Thornbrook. "Eva," he greeted her, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Didn't think I'd see you back here. Didn't think I'd ever come back," she replied, matching his tone. "How's everything?" Jonah's face darkened for a moment, his gaze shifting to the horizon where the blood moon would soon rise. "You shouldn't have come back. Not now." Eva frowned. "What are you talking about?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This place, it's not what it used to be. Things have changed. There are traditions now. You don't want to get involved." "Traditions?" Eva scoffed. "This sounds like some old wives' tale." Jonah didn't smile. "You need to be careful, Eva. The blood moon is coming. You shouldn't be here when it does." Before she could press him further, Jonah turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the fading light. His words lingered, echoing in her mind long after he disappeared. That night, as Eva lay in bed, the silence of the house was broken by a distant sound, low and rhythmic, like chanting. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but as she listened, it grew louder, filling the room with its eerie cadence. She sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear where it was coming from. The chanting was coming from outside. Eva rushed to the window, pulling the curtains aside. The street below was empty, bathed in the pale light of the rising moon. There was no one there, yet the chanting persisted, growing louder, more insistent. She flung the door open and stepped out into the cool night air. But the moment her feet hit the ground, the chanting stopped. Everything was silent again. The next morning, shaken but determined to understand what was happening, Eva searched her mother's room. She found the journal tucked away in a drawer, old and worn, its pages yellowed with age. Flipping through it, she found a passage written in her mother's handwriting. "The blood moon demands its due. Every year, a sacrifice must be made to keep the spirits at bay. It is our burden, our curse. The ritual must never be broken, or the town will suffer." Eva stared at the words, a chill running down her spine. Chapter 2. The Whispering Walls. The stillness of Thornbrook had settled into Eva's bones like a lingering chill, and the eerie quiet only seemed to deepen as the days crawled by. She couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had begun gnawing at her from the moment she set foot in the town. The more she thought about Jonah's cryptic warning and the unsettling chanting from the night before, the more it felt like she was missing some crucial piece of a puzzle she didn't even know existed. Sitting at her mother's old oak desk, Eva flipped open the journal she had discovered in Agnes's drawer. The faded ink and brittle pages felt like they carried the weight of centuries of secrets. The entries were scattered, disjointed at times, as if her mother had written in a frenzy, trying to pour out her thoughts before someone stopped her. Her eyes scanned the familiar, neat handwriting that had started to waver toward the latter half of the journal. Her mother had always been a precise woman, every thought neatly organized, but these pages were erratic, almost manic. The words seemed to tremble on the page, speaking of the blood moon and the offering with a kind of reverence that sent shivers down her spine. "The blood moon comes once every 20 years. We must make the offering to keep the darkness away. To protect the town, to protect us all, one must be chosen." Eva's heart thudded in her chest as the memory of her childhood resurfaced. She remembered the way the village had seemed to change in the days leading up to the blood moon, the uneasy tension in the air, the hushed whispers of the adults as they exchanged anxious glances. As a child, she had thought it was some silly superstition, something the old folks had passed down, a relic from a more fearful time. But now, with each passing entry, that fear was beginning to feel all too real. Why hadn't she noticed it before? How had she not seen the signs? The blood moon was approaching again, and just as it had 20 years ago, the town seemed to be holding its breath. Eva closed the journal, her thoughts churning like storm clouds. The word sacrifice lingered at the edge of her mind, filling her with a growing dread. There was no denying it now. Whatever was happening in Thornbrook, it was connected to this ancient ritual, and her family seemed to be entangled in it in ways she couldn't yet understand. Later that afternoon, Eva sat at her mother's bedside, studying the frail figure that had once been so strong. Agnes's eyes fluttered open, their once sharp blue now clouded with age and illness. There was a flicker of recognition, followed by a vacant stare. Her mother had always been a stubborn woman, but now she seemed diminished, as if the years of keeping Thornbrook's secrets had taken their toll on her soul. "Mom," Eva began, her voice soft but firm. "I found your journal. The blood moon, what does it mean? What is this offering?" Agnes blinked slowly, her gaze unfocused. For a moment, Eva thought she wouldn't respond, that her mother's mind was too far gone. But then, her lips trembled, and she whispered, "The offering, we must protect the town, always." "Protect it from what?" Eva pressed, leaning closer. "What are you talking about?" Agnes shook her head weakly, her voice barely audible. "The spirits, they come with the moon, they take what they are owed." She fell silent, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Eva's frustration bubbled up. "What spirits? What are you saying?" But her mother didn't answer. She only muttered incoherently, her mind drifting somewhere far beyond Eva's reach. "It's her turn." Just like her father. Eva froze. Her father had disappeared when she was a child, vanished without a trace. Her mother had always been vague about it, telling her that he had left, that he had gone away. But now those words, just like her father, sent a cold wave of fear through her. What had her father been involved in? What had really happened to him? She gripped her mother's hand, hoping to pull her back, to force more answers from her. "What do you mean, just like Dad? What happened to him?" But Agnes was lost to her now, slipping in and out of delirium, her whispers fading into unintelligible murmurs. Determined to find answers, Eva made her way to the church later that evening. The tall, imposing structure stood at the edge of town like a silent sentinel, its stone walls weathered by years of service to a town that seemed to have forgotten its purpose. Reverend Carter had been a fixture in Thornbrook for as long as she could remember, and if anyone knew about the town's secrets, it would be him. The church's heavy wooden doors creaked as she pushed them open, and the scent of incense greeted her like a stale memory. Candles flickered in the dim light, casting long, distorted shadows across the stone floor. Reverend Carter stood at the altar, his back to her, murmuring a prayer in a language she didn't recognize. "Reverend," Eva called, her voice echoing in the vast, empty space. He turned slowly, his eyes cold and piercing. His face was sharp, almost skeletal, and there was something unsettling in the way he looked at her, like he could see right through her. "Eva," he greeted her, though there was no warmth in his voice. "It's been a long time since you last visited our town. What brings you here now?" She swallowed the lump in her throat. "I need to know about the blood moon, about the offering. My mother's been talking about it, and I found her journal." The Reverend's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, something dark and guarded. The blood moon is a sacred tradition in Thornbrook. It is not for outsiders to question. "Outsider?" Eva frowned. "I grew up here." "You left," he replied, his tone sharp. "That makes you an outsider." Eva bristled at his words but pressed on. "My father disappeared during the last blood moon. I want to know what happened to him." Reverend Carter's lips curled into a thin, joyless smile. "Some things are better left in the past, child. The blood moon is a time of reflection, of sacrifice. It's best you don't meddle in affairs you don't understand." The hairs on the back of Eva's neck stood on end. "What are you hiding?" The Reverend didn't answer. Instead, he turned away, his voice low and cryptic. "The blood moon comes for us all. Some must give more than others." The days crept closer to the night of the blood moon, and the town seemed to slip further into madness. People began acting strange, more so than before. Neighbors whispered to one another, casting furtive glances at Eva whenever she passed. Doors closed as she approached, and conversations hushed in her presence. It was as if the entire town was in on some dark secret, one they refused to share with her. At night, the whispering returned, only now it wasn't just from outside. Eva could hear it in the walls of the house, faint voices seeping through the cracks like a distant, haunting echo. They spoke in fragmented phrases, words that danced on the edge of her understanding. It's her. She'll be the one, like before. She lay in bed, her heart racing, trying to make sense of it all. The shadows in the corners of her room seemed to stretch and shift, as if something unseen lurked just beyond the edge of her vision. The walls themselves seemed to hum with a quiet energy, a presence she couldn't explain. Then, one night, as she sat in her mother's room, watching over her in the dim light, Agnes stirred from her restless sleep. Her eyes fluttered open, and for the briefest moment they were clear, focused. "It's her turn this year," she muttered, her voice a harsh rasp, just like her father. Eva's blood ran cold. She had known all along that her family was somehow connected to the strange events surrounding the Blood Moon. But now, the truth was beginning to surface. The whispers, the chanting, the cryptic warnings from Jonah and Reverend Carter, it all pointed to one terrible conclusion. This wasn't just about the town. This was about her. Her father had been taken by the Blood Moon ritual, and now it was her turn. Chapter 3. The Blood Moon Rises. The days passed in a slow, agonizing crawl, each one darker and more suffocating than the last. Thornbrook, once a town merely shrouded in silence, now felt like it was sinking under the weight of something ancient and unseen. The sky was growing murkier, the air thicker, as if the very atmosphere anticipated the coming of the Blood Moon. People on the streets hurried by, heads low, barely exchanging words with one another, their faces drawn with a tension that buzzed just beneath the surface. Eva had never felt more out of place. She wandered through the town square, watching the shopkeepers hurriedly close their doors early. The whispers were constant now, low and hushed, barely audible, but persistent enough to make her skin crawl. They had started following her wherever she went, the townspeople's eyes casting sidelong glances her way, as though she were an uninvited guest at a gathering meant only for the initiated. It was as if they knew something she didn't, something they were all complicit in keeping from her. The Blood Moon was approaching, and whatever it meant for Thornbrook, Eva could feel it creeping into her very bones. As the days grew shorter and the shadows longer, Eva sought out Jonah once again, desperate for answers. His office at the sheriff's station was dimly lit, the blinds drawn as if to keep the outside world at bay. Jonah sat behind his cluttered desk, his usually calm demeanor replaced by a restlessness that made him look older, worn. Eva stormed in, her frustration barely contained. "Jonah, enough with the riddles. I need the truth, now." He glanced up at her, his eyes tired but sharp with a kind of wariness that she hadn't seen before. He didn't immediately respond, simply sighing as though bracing himself for a difficult conversation. "You shouldn't be here, Eva," he said quietly, his voice heavy. "I told you before. You should have left when you had the chance." Eva crossed her arms, standing firm. "I'm not going anywhere until you tell me what's really going on in this town. What is the Blood Moon? What's the ritual?" Jonah shifted in his seat, running a hand through his hair. His eyes darted to the window, as if checking for unseen watchers, before he finally spoke, his voice low and careful. "The Blood Moon. It's been a part of Thornbrook's history for as long as anyone can remember. Generations ago, the founders made a pact, a promise to keep the spirits at bay, and every blood moon they offer a sacrifice." Eva's heart pounded in her chest. A sacrifice? To what? "To whatever lurks beneath the surface," Jonah said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Blood Moon wakes something up, something dark and old. The town owes a debt, and every 20 years that debt has to be paid." Eva stared at him, horrified. "And the town just goes along with this? Year after year?" Jonah's jaw tightened. "They believe they have no choice. The Blood Moon is a warning. If the offering isn't made, terrible things happen. Things you can't imagine." His eyes flicked to hers, full of regret. "I don't agree with it, Eva. I never have. But the town follows the old ways. Always has." Eva felt her stomach turn. What kind of town sacrifices its own people to appease some ancient spirits? "The kind that's afraid of what happens if it doesn't," Jonah replied grimly. "The last time the sacrifice wasn't made, there was a fire. Half the town burned. People died, horribly." Eva's head spun. "And this year, Who's supposed to be the sacrifice? Jonah looked away, his silence damning. Realization dawned on her slowly, a chilling cold creeping up her spine. It's me, isn't it? That's why everyone is acting so strange. That's why you wanted me to leave. Jonah's expression was pained as he finally met her eyes. Your family? They've always been involved, Eva. Your ancestors were the ones who first made the pact. They were the town's protectors. But when my father disappeared, Eva cut in, her voice bitter. Jonah nodded slowly. It wasn't just that he disappeared. He was taken. He was meant to be the sacrifice 20 years ago. Eva felt like the ground had dropped out from beneath her. Her father hadn't abandoned her. He hadn't left without a word. He had been chosen, just like her, and no one had told her the truth. She gritted her teeth, her voice shaking with anger. And now the town thinks it's my turn. Jonah rose from his chair, crossing the room toward her. Eva, you don't have to be here. You can still leave. Get out of Thornbrook before it's too late. But Eva shook her head. No, I'm not running. I'm going to figure out how to stop this. There has to be a way to break this curse. Jonah's face was etched with worry. You don't know what you're up against. I don't care, Eva shot back. I'm not going to let them kill me for some ritual that's been twisted and warped over centuries. I'm going to fight. That night, the sky darkened as the blood moon finally crept over the horizon, its crimson glow casting an eerie light across the town. Thornbrook, already suffocating under its oppressive atmosphere, now felt otherworldly. The buildings looked warped in the blood moon's light, their shadows stretching long and unnatural across the ground. Eva stood at her bedroom window, staring up at the swollen moon. It hung low in the sky, large and foreboding, as if it were watching her, waiting for her. She knew what was coming. The journal, Jonah's warning, her mother's fragmented mutterings, they all pointed the same grim truth. This was the night of the offering. This was the night the town expected her to fulfill a blood debt that had been passed down through generations. But she wasn't going to let it happen. Downstairs, the sound of her mother's labored breathing filled the house, mingling with the whispering wind outside. Agnes hadn't spoken since that night when she had let slip that it was her turn. Whether out of guilt or fear, her mother had withdrawn completely, leaving Eva to piece together the broken shards of her family's past alone. Eva grabbed the journal again, flipping through the pages with renewed urgency. There had to be something she was missing, some way to stop this. The entry spoke of rituals, of offerings, but there was no mention of an alternative, no hint of what might happen if she refused to go along with it. Her hands trembled as she reached the final pages, and then she saw it, a passage she hadn't noticed before. The debt must be paid, but the bloodline holds the key. Eva frowned, rereading the words. The bloodline holds the key. What did that mean? Could it be referring to her family's role in the ritual? If her ancestors had been the ones to forge this dark pact, perhaps they were also the ones who could break it. Suddenly, a noise outside broke through her thoughts. A rustling, faint but distinct, like footsteps on the gravel path leading to the house. Eva's heart raced as she crept to the window, peering out into the blood-tinged night. A group of figures stood in the distance, barely visible in the shadowy light. They were moving slowly, deliberately, toward the house. Their shapes were distorted in the moon's crimson glow, but she could make out the familiar outline of Reverend Carter at the front, his dark robes billowing in the wind. Behind him, the townspeople followed in a silent procession, their faces masked by the night but their purpose clear. They were coming for her. The ritual was beginning. Eva's mind raced as she backed away from the window. She couldn't let them take her, not like they had taken her father. She had to find a way out, a way to stop them. But the town was already closing in, and the blood moon loomed high in the sky, its pull growing stronger with every passing minute. She grabbed a flashlight and hurried downstairs, her heart pounding in her chest. Agnes was still asleep, her frail body barely stirring as Eva passed by her bedside. Eva hesitated for a moment, wondering if she should wake her mother, but something inside her told her that Agnes was beyond saving. This was her fight now. The door rattled in its frame as the townspeople gathered outside, their muffled voices blending with the howling wind. Eva could hear Reverend Carter's deep, commanding tone. calling for her to come out to fulfill her family's duty, but she wasn't going to obey. With a final glance at her mother's sleeping form, Eva steeled herself and slipped out the back door, disappearing into the night as the blood moon bathed the town in its sinister glow. Chapter 4. The Price of Tradition. The dawn broke with a sinister brightness, illuminating Thornbrook in a way that felt otherworldly. The townspeople moved like shadows in the early morning light, their faces blank and drained of emotion. Eva watched from a hidden vantage point behind a thick cluster of trees, her heart pounding as she witnessed the chilling preparations unfolding before her. The square, usually a place of community and laughter, had been transformed into a scene of stark horror. Wooden pyres, hastily constructed, lined the edges, their rough-hewn frames waiting patiently to be lit. Stacks of dry kindling sat piled high, while others laid out ceremonial altars, draped in dark cloth and adorned with grotesque tokens meant to appease whatever spirits they feared. A chill ran down her spine as she realized that this was not just a mere tradition, it was an expectation steeped in blood and loss. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the town, Reverend Carter stood at the center of the square, his voice rising above the murmurs of the crowd. "We must honor our ancestors," he declared, his words filled with a fervor that made Eva's skin crawl. "Tonight, we will offer our sacrifice, and in doing so, we will protect our homes from the wrath of the spirits awakened by the blood moon." Jonah stood beside the Reverend, his face taut with worry. Though he had once been a friend, his presence now felt suffocating, a reminder of the heavy burden resting on her shoulders. She could see the fear etched into his features, the internal conflict raging behind his eyes. He glanced around at the townsfolk, their expressions vacant, resigned. It was as if they had accepted their fate without question, too steeped in the lore of the past to challenge the cycle of violence that had become their lives. "Eva," Jonah called out softly, his voice a mere whisper amidst the rising tension. She stepped forward, caught in a web of conflicting emotions. "You don't have to do this. You can leave." "But where would I go?" she shot back, anger flaring in her chest. "This is my home. It's not fair to run away when I'm the one they want." Jonah looked pained. "You can't let them take you. This isn't right. We have to find a way to stop this." "Stop what?" she retorted, bitterness spilling from her lips. "Stop a ritual that has claimed countless lives? Stop a tradition that offers nothing but blood in return for fear? You're just as complicit as they are." His face hardened, but beneath that resolve she saw a flicker of understanding. "I'm scared, Eva. You don't know what will happen if we don't follow through. If the spirits are unleashed, then let them come," she cried out, her voice echoing off the surrounding buildings. "I would rather face the spirits than become a part of this nightmare." Carter, sensing the growing unrest, turned his gaze toward her, his eyes narrowing with a predatory gleam. "You misunderstand, child. This is not merely a tradition. It is a necessity. The spirits demand payment. Your life is the cost of your family's legacy. The longer you resist, the more perilous our situation becomes." His words hung in the air, heavy with implications. Eva felt a darkness creeping in, tightening its grip on her heart. "You think I'll just accept that I'm a pawn in this twisted game?" "It's not a game, Eva," Jonah interjected, desperation lacing his tone. "You have to understand, if we don't offer you, the spirits will retaliate. The last time a sacrifice was denied." He trailed off, the memory of the past hanging heavy between them. The fear in his eyes mirrored her own, but it only fueled her rage. How could they be so blind? How could they accept such cruelty as their fate? The weight of history pressed upon her, and she realized with a sickening clarity that this was the legacy she had inherited. A cycle of violence that seemed impossible to break. In a moment of clarity, Eva recalled the truth she had stumbled upon in her mother's journal. The revelation that her father had been the previous sacrifice, chosen by the very people she had grown up with. The anguish that erupted within her was raw and unfathomable. He had not simply disappeared. He had been taken, offered up to satisfy the blood debt the town had accrued over the years. And her mother, Agnes, had stood by, complicit in that horror. The realization struck her like a physical blow. Was her mother's silence born of fear, or was it acceptance? Devastated, Eva's thoughts raced. She had so many questions, so many feelings swirling inside her like a storm. Rage battled with sorrow, and as the blood moon drew closer, she felt the darkness pressing against her soul. What had her father endured? Had he fought? Had he even known what was to come? Caught in this whirlwind of emotions, Eva wrestled with her conflicting desires. She yearned for vengeance against those who had stolen her father from her. But more than that, she wanted to put an end to this cycle of terror that gripped Thornbrook. The anger that filled her began to morph into a steely determination. She could not let her father's death be in vain. "What if I refuse?" she challenged, meeting the Reverend's cold gaze with newfound defiance. "What if I make it clear that I will not be your offering?" Reverend Carter's expression darkened. "You think you have a choice? Tradition is not something you can simply defy. The spirits will come for what is theirs, whether you choose to act or not. Your family's role cannot be ignored." "What if I change the rules?" she spat, a plan beginning to form in her mind. "What if I take action to disrupt this farce? What if I expose the truth behind this ritual?" "Eva, think clearly," Jonah pleaded. "What you're suggesting is dangerous. The spirits are not just a story. They are real. They will not take kindly to disobedience." "But allowing them to take me willingly?" she countered, her voice rising. "That's the true danger." A commotion from the square interrupted their heated exchange, and Eva turned her gaze to see the townspeople gathering around the altar. They were preparing for the ritual, their movements mechanical and devoid of joy. It felt as if they had surrendered their souls to the sinister tradition, blinded by generations of fear. As the crowd chanted, reverberating through the air, Eva's resolve crystallized. She would not become another victim in this blood-soaked history. She would not let her father's death be repeated through her own sacrifice. With a sudden burst of courage, she turned to Jonah. "I have to stop them," she declared, adrenaline surging through her veins. "Tonight will not be like any other blood moon. I'm going to sabotage this ritual." Jonah's eyes widened with fear and disbelief. "But if you do that, you don't know what might happen. The spirits." "I'd rather face the spirits than become a puppet for their twisted games," she interrupted, a fire igniting within her. "I won't let them control my fate any longer. I won't let them control the fate of this town." She dashed off, determination propelling her forward, even as the air crackled with energy and dread. But as she ran toward the square, the ground beneath her seemed to tremble, and a low, haunting whisper echoed in her mind, chilling her to the core. "The spirits stir. The time has come." With every step closer to the altar, Eva felt an ominous energy wrapping around her. The townspeople were entranced, their eyes glazed as they moved in unison, bound by tradition. The Reverend's voice rose above the chanting, incantations spilling forth that seemed to tug at the very fabric of reality. She needed to act quickly. As she reached the perimeter of the makeshift altar, Eva scanned the area, her mind racing. The ceremonial pyres, stacked high and ready to ignite, stood ominously at the center. She spotted a canister of fuel nearby, used to light the flames that would consume whatever sacrifice they intended to offer. Taking a deep breath, she darted toward it, her heart racing as she moved against the tide of the townsfolk, who remained oblivious to her actions. She could hear the chant growing louder, an oppressive sound that filled her with dread. But she pressed on, grabbing the canister and positioning herself behind the altar. Before she could lose her nerve, she unscrewed the cap and began pouring the liquid onto the pyres, dousing them in a layer of flammable fuel. The liquid pooled, glistening in the eerie glow of the blood moon. But as she worked, the chanting shifted, the air thickening with an unnatural presence. The temperature dropped and shadows lengthened around her, whispering secrets in a language she couldn't understand. Suddenly a voice broke through the haze, a low growl that reverberated in her chest, an echo of something ancient. "You cannot escape your destiny, child." The realization hit her like a fist to the gut. The spirits were awakening, their power fueled by her defiance. But she couldn't turn back now. She would not become part of this cycle. Eva finished pouring the fuel and stepped back, ready to light the pyres. "Eva!" Jonah's voice cut through the chaos, desperate and panicked. He rushed toward her, fear etched in every line of his face. "What are you doing?" "Ending this," she shouted, gripping a match tightly in her hand. But just as she prepared to strike the match, a gust of wind swept through the square, extinguishing the light. The chanting intensified, rising to a fever pitch, the townspeople becoming animated, their faces twisted in terror. The spirits were growing restless, demanding their due. "Jonah, help me!" Eva cried, fear clawing at her throat. "We need to light these pyres before they come for us." Jonah hesitated, torn between his fear for her safety and the knowledge of what would happen if she succeeded. "Eva, please, you don't know what you're doing." With a swift motion, she struck the match, the flame flickering to life. The moment the fire caught the pyres, a piercing scream erupted from the crowd, echoing through the town. Shadows began to writhe and coil around the townsfolk, their faces contorting in terror as the spirits surged forth, demanding their sacrifice. In that moment, Eva felt a surge of power, a rush of energy that coursed through her veins. She could feel the spirits pulling at her, beckoning her to join them. But she held firm, knowing that she would not yield. But as the fire blazed higher, the ground trembled violently, and the air filled with a cacophony of wails and whispers, drowning out everything else. The spirits were angry, their hunger palpable as they clawed their way into the physical realm. Eva stood resolute, but as she looked into the eyes of her neighbors, people she had known her entire life, she felt a pang of regret. They had all been ensnared by the same fear, caught in a web spun by tradition. In that moment, she understood. The price of tradition was not just her life, it was the lives of everyone in Thornbrook. And if she was to break the cycle, she would have to face the spirits, not as a sacrifice, but as a challenger. "Join me," she shouted to Jonah, her voice cutting through the chaos. "We can break this curse together." With determination burning in her chest, Eva stepped forward, ready to confront whatever spirits awaited her. Tonight, she would not be their pawn. She would reclaim her destiny and force the spirits to reckon with the power of the living. As the flames crackled around her and the spirits began to materialize from the shadows, she took a deep breath, steeling herself for the battle to come. The time for sacrifice was over. Tonight was the night she would forge her own path. Chapter 5. Breaking the Curse. The moon hung low in the sky, a deep crimson orb casting an eerie light over Thornbrook. Shadows twisted and turned, a cloak of darkness wrapping around the town as the blood moon illuminated the streets. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation and dread as the townspeople gathered in the central square, their faces pale and eyes glazed with fear. Whispers filled the air, and the sound of anxious breaths echoed like a funeral dirge. Eva's heart raced as she was dragged toward the ceremonial altar, her hands bound tightly. She struggled against her captors. The familiar faces of neighbors turned into strangers, consumed by fear and tradition. Reverend Carter strode at the forefront, his voice booming over the crowd, stirring their hysteria like a conductor leading an orchestra of madness. "Tonight, we will appease the spirits," he proclaimed, his eyes wild with zeal. "We will sacrifice one among us to ensure the safety of our town." A cold wave of terror washed over Eva as she glanced at Jonah, standing at the edge of the crowd. His eyes were filled with uncertainty, his body rigid with the weight of his decision. For a moment, their gazes locked, and she saw the internal struggle mirrored in his expression, fear battling against the loyalty he felt for her. "Jonah," she shouted, her voice barely breaking through the tumult. "You have to help me. This isn't right." But the townsfolk had begun to chant, a low murmur that rose in intensity, drowning out her pleas. The energy in the air felt electric, crackling with tension as the blood moon cast its malevolent glow over the scene. Reverend Carter raised his hands, directing the chant with fervor, a maestro orchestrating a deadly symphony. As they reached the altar, Eva's mind raced with desperation. In that moment, she caught a glimpse of her mother, Agnes, standing at the edge of the crowd, her expression a mixture of sorrow and resignation. In that instant, time froze, and Eva felt a powerful pull, as though an invisible thread bound them together. "Mother," Eva cried, her voice breaking, "help me. We can end this." Agnes hesitated, her gaze flickering between Eva and the altar. Finally, she pushed her way through the crowd, her voice barely a whisper. "Eva, listen to me!" The townspeople continued their chant, but the sound faded as Eva focused solely on her mother. "It's not just the town, Eva. Our family has been tied to this curse for generations. We bound the spirits in our own fear and ignorance. To break it, we must offer ourselves as the final sacrifice. Tears brimmed in Eva's eyes. But why? Why should we be the ones to pay for the mistakes of the past? Because it is the only way, Agnes said, her voice trembling. If we do not stop the ritual, the spirits will claim not only you but everyone here. They will be unleashed upon the town, and there will be no escaping their wrath. Eva's heart raced, torn between the weight of her family's legacy and the lives of those around her. Then I must do it, she declared, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. I will not let them suffer for our sins. As she stepped toward the altar, the chanting grew louder, and the townspeople's faces twisted with desperation. Jonah, fueled by a surge of defiance, rushed forward, grabbing her arm. No, Eva, you can't do this. The Reverend's eyes darkened with anger, his voice sharp as he commanded the crowd, seize her. She must pay for her family's sins. In that instant, the atmosphere shifted. The spirits, sensing the disruption, began to swirl around the square, dark shadows coalescing into terrifying forms. Wails and screams erupted from the crowd as the air thickened with the scent of fear and despair. Jonah stood his ground, defiant against the tide of townsfolk. We won't let you do this, he shouted, pulling Eva away from the altar. Together, we can stop this. The Reverend's face contorted in rage, his voice a thunderous roar. You are betraying your town. You are inviting doom upon us all. But Eva felt a flicker of hope ignite within her, a spark fueled by the strength of her resolve. No, we are taking back our lives. We are breaking this cycle of sacrifice. As the spirits surged forth, their fury palpable, Eva and Jonah moved in unison, determined to dismantle the ritual. They began to chant, their voices rising above the chaos, calling upon the power of the living to stand against the dead. Spirits of the past, hear us. We will not be your pawns any longer. We reclaim our fate. The ground trembled beneath them, and the sky darkened as the spirits howled in rage. Shadows lashed out, swirling around Jonah and Eva, threatening to engulf them. But together, they stood firm, fueled by a newfound strength. Your reign of terror ends tonight, Eva shouted, her voice echoing like a clarion call. As the spirits collided with the energy of their rebellion, a blinding light erupted, illuminating the square with a fierce glow. The townsfolk gasped, their fear momentarily eclipsed by the brilliance surrounding Eva and Jonah. In the midst of the chaos, Eva faced the spirits, her heart pounding in her chest. The air crackled with tension, and she felt the weight of her ancestors' sins pressing down upon her. But she refused to yield. Leave this place, she commanded, her voice steady and unwavering. You will not take any more from us. We will not sacrifice ourselves for your anger any longer. The spirits hesitated, their forms flickering in the light, a moment of confusion passing through their ranks. The crowd watched in awe, fear and wonder mixing in their expressions. As the tension mounted, Eva knew she stood at the precipice of a monumental battle, a battle not just for her life, but for the very soul of Thornbrook. The chaos swirled around them, but she was resolute. With the lives of her friends and family hanging in the balance, Eva prepared to face whatever wrath the spirits would unleash. Tonight, she would reclaim her destiny, and the curse that had bound them for generations would be broken, one way or another. Chapter 6. The Final Offering. The chaos erupted as the spirits, released from their centuries-old shackles, roamed the streets of Thornbrook, unleashing their fury upon the town. Dark clouds gathered above, swirling ominously as the blood moon loomed like a vengeful eye. Buildings trembled under the wrath of the angry spirits. Windows shattered, and fires broke out, illuminating the terror on the faces of the townspeople. Eva stood at the altar, heart racing, as the shadows of the spirits twisted and writhed around her, their anger palpable. She felt the weight of their rage bearing down on her, the echoes of her ancestors' sins reverberating in the air. She was cornered, trapped between her past and the terrifying unknown that lay ahead. Jonah, she screamed, her voice nearly drowned out by the cacophony of destruction. He pushed his way through the chaos, fear etched on his face. Eva, we have to get out of here. No, she shouted back, desperation fueling her resolve. They want something from me. They want my bloodline. Realization hit her like a thunderclap. The spirits were not seeking just any sacrifice. They craved the essence of her ancestry. the very lineage that had invoked them so many generations ago. She could feel the connection, the pull of her heritage, intertwining with the dark forces surrounding them. In that moment of clarity, she understood that to break the curse, she had to confront it head-on. The townspeople around her were possessed, their eyes hollow and vacant, bodies moving as if controlled by an unseen force. "I won't let them take anyone else," Eva declared, her voice ringing with determination. "I will offer myself willingly to end this once and for all." Jonah's expression turned from fear to horror. "No, Eva, you can't. There must be another way." But Eva shook her head, the decision solidifying in her heart. This was her moment to reclaim the power of her lineage, to break the cycle of fear and sacrifice that had gripped Thornbrook for generations. "This is the only way, Jonah. I have to do this." As she stepped forward, the spirits hesitated, momentarily confused by her willingness to accept her fate. In that heartbeat, she felt the energy shift, the dark currents swirling around her. The spirits began to converge, their forms coalescing into a swirling vortex of anger and sorrow. "Spirits of my ancestors, I offer myself to you." Eva cried out, her voice steady. "I am here to end this curse, to break the chains that bind you to this place." The shadows thickened, swirling menacingly, and Eva felt their gaze upon her. In that instant, she felt the power of her lineage surge through her, a connection to the generations that had come before her. As she extended her arms, ready to embrace her destiny, a calm enveloped her, replacing her fear with an overwhelming sense of purpose. The spirits paused, and for the first time, Eva saw their expressions shift. Confusion gave way to something more profound, a glimmer of understanding. In that dramatic moment, the anger that had driven them began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of release. As she willingly surrendered herself, the spirits began to unravel, their forms shimmering like smoke in the wind. The dark energy that had consumed the town for so long started to fade, the chaos quieting as the blood moon's light dimmed. The howling wind stilled, and the oppressive weight that had hung over Thornbrook began to lift. With each passing moment, the world around her transformed. The shadows that had plagued the town for generations receded, and as the blood moon's light waned, the night returned to its natural hue. The spirits, once so vengeful, now drifted away, their anger dissipating like mist in the morning sun. Jonah watched in helpless disbelief, tears streaming down his face as he realized what was happening. "Eva, no," he cried, reaching out toward her as she began to vanish into the light. "Remember me, Jonah," she whispered, her voice barely audible amidst the silence that followed. "This is the only way." And with that, she was gone, swallowed by the very light that had freed the town from its torment. The air felt still, a profound silence blanketing Thornbrook, a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded just moments before. As dawn broke, the town awoke to a new reality. The sun rose over the horizon, bathing the streets in warm golden light for the first time in generations. Jonah wandered through the eerily quiet town, reflecting on the sacrifice Eva had made for the sake of their community. He walked past the remnants of the ritual, now mere shadows of their former selves, remnants of a past steeped in fear and darkness. The townsfolk emerged from their homes, confusion evident on their faces as they realized the horror had subsided. They looked around, bewildered by the sudden return to normalcy, but Jonah knew better. The memory of that night lingered in the air, a silent testament to the price they had paid for freedom. As the town began to rebuild, stories of Eva's sacrifice spread, a legacy of bravery that inspired hope in their hearts. But as Jonah walked away from Thornbrook, he couldn't shake the feeling that the curse might not be entirely broken. Just as he reached the edge of town, he noticed a small child kneeling on the ground, playing with a ceremonial artifact that had somehow survived the destruction. The faint red glow of the blood moon reappeared in the sky, a haunting reminder of the past, flickering ominously as if signaling the return of something dark. Jonah's heart sank, a chill creeping down his spine. He turned to look back at Thornbrook, the memories of Eva's sacrifice echoing in his mind. The cycle may have been disrupted, but he knew that the shadows of the past were not easily cast aside. Some legacies were destined to linger, their grip on the living as tight as ever.